Now for that, I'm back in this first Go program, which we wrote in the previous course section, and you find this simple program also attached. This folder with this firstapp.go file. Now before we dive deeper into values, variables, and so on, let's have a look at the code we have here and explore some core syntax features which we see here. Now, what we see here are a couple of keywords, for example, package, import, func. And these are some of the most important keywords you will see in Go programs. I'll come back to packages later, but I want to focus on imports right away. When you write Go code, as in many other programming languages as well, you don't write all the code, all the low-level code on your own necessarily. Instead, you often use third-party packages, third-party code packages that provide certain functionalities to you. And Go has a so-called standard library, which is a set of built-in packages which you don't need to install or download separately, but which you can use in your code just like this, since you installed Go globally on your system already. And here in this code snippet, when we import FMT, we are importing one of these standard library packages. But the import keyword in general can always be used to include other code into this code file so that we can use features, for example, functionalities made available by that imported code in this code file here. And here we happen to import a built-in package, the FMT package. We could also import third-party packages written by other developers, not built into Go, and we'll see that later in the course. So that's what this import keyword does. It unlocks extra functionality in this overall code file. And we see that functionality in action here in line 6. We use that package here, the FMT package, and then in the end we execute a so-called function that's made available by this package. In this case, the println function, which stands for print line, which in the end just outputs some content into the terminal and then enters a new line thereafter. That's why it's called print line, println. It reserves a full line in that terminal to output that content, which we have between these parentheses here. Now, before I take a closer look at this content, let's take a look at this func keyword. This is a keyword which is used to create a so-called function, and we are going to dive into functions later, but in the end it's a code block that will be executed once this function is called. And we will also see how we can call functions later. We basically already see it here in line 6, where we call this println function. We call a function by adding parentheses thereafter. But this main function is actually never called by us, but instead main is a special function name, which we can add in our Go files. And it's this function which will be executed by default when we execute this file with Go, which is what we do when we run go run and then this first app.go file name. If we do that, if we execute this file with Go, Go will automatically look for a function named main and execute that function for us. And that's why we see hello world in the terminal here. Now, if you're coming from other programming languages, there are certain conventions you might know from these languages, which you might see here as well, or which you might not see here. For example, in some programming languages, you have semicolons at the end of every line, and you can add those in Go as well. Technically, you actually even have to add them. And nonetheless, the convention is to omit them. Why? Because during the compilation, Go will add them for you. It's a simple extra convenience so that you don't have to add them yourselves, and therefore it is the convention not to add semicolons at the end of the line. Instead, we omit them and Go will add them behind the scenes during compilation, so to say. Now, how does Go add them? Basically at the end of every line, you could say, unless we have something like this where we have a curly brace opening up in line 5. Now, because Go adds such a semicolon after every line, you, for example, can't write the main function like this. This would be allowed in some other programming languages, and it might even be the convention in some other programming languages to have the opening curly brace in a new line, but it's not the case in Go. As you see, the file name turned red. Also here, if I open that side menu, and that indicates that there is an error in this file. And we do have red squiggly lines here in line 6, and if we hover over that, we see that there is an unexpected semicolon or a new line before this opening curly brace. And keep in mind what I just said. Go automatically adds a semicolon when it compiles this code whenever a line ends. So Go behind the scenes does that. It adds this semicolon. And then this opening curly brace simply doesn't belong to this function anymore. So in Go, we actually should have that opening curly brace in the same line as the function definition with this func keyword. And that's just something to note about this syntax. Another thing to note is indentation. In Go, we indent by hitting the Tab key. And if you have that Go extension installed here in Visual Studio Code, it should automatically indent this correctly. Now, unlike in Python, for example, indentation is not required for technical reasons though. We do have curly braces to clearly mark the beginning and end of this function code, for example, but it's purely there for readability, and you should indent your code to make it very clear which code belongs to which function. We only have one function here, but of course in more complex programs you'll also quickly have multiple functions. So indentation is something you should do with the Tab key for readability reasons. You can also always use a specific shortcut if you go to the keyboard shortcuts here in Visual Studio Code and search for Format Document. This shortcut, when pressed, will auto-format your file. And if I remove that tab and press this shortcut, it should therefore automatically add this indentation. If it does not do that, you can open your workspace settings by opening this command palette, also with this shortcut, and there search for workspace settings and open those workspace settings. And here, if you search for default formatter, you want to make sure that Go is selected here as a default formatter. And once that is done, you will have a .VS Code folder in your project folder, which just contains some VS Code editor settings. Specifically, it sets that default formatter to this Go extension for this project. And now if I hit this auto format shortcut, this indentation was added. And these are some important core syntax features you have to know when you work with Go. Now with that core syntax out of the way, let's explore variables and values. In any program we write, no matter if it's written with Go or with other programming languages, we always work with values. All our programs in the end are about doing something with values. No matter if you write a program that reads a file and then maybe produces a file, it's all about values. The data in a file is a value. The produced file contains a lot of values. So values are everywhere, and therefore they are the heart of Go programs as well. And in its most simplest form, we can of course think about operations like 2 plus 5, where we have two values, 2 and 5, that are combined with help of the add operation, because that's the other important part. All these values on their own are useless. Our programs become useful because we then do something with values. We read the values in a file. Reading, that's the operation we do then. And we might do that to then transform the values. Here we are adding two numbers together. So these are operations which we perform on values. And hence, values and operations are super important in any programming language, and Go, of course, is no exception. But most of the time, you don't just use values once or in one line only, but instead often you want to store values. And for that you have variables. Variables are data containers for values, and you can use them to store a value so that you can use the same value in different lines of code simply by using the same variable that holds a certain value over and over again. You can use variables to store results or intermediate results. And you can use variables in operations and possibly also reassign values to variables. That's why it's called a variable. The value stored in a variable isn't set in stone. It can change, and you can store a new value in an existing variable. Now, this might be all super trivial for you if you already have some programming experience, which is of course what I do recommend for this course. Nonetheless, it is super important to be aware of these basics to understand how programs fundamentally work. Now, with that knowledge, let's come back to this code. And in this code, we actually already see a value and an operation. Can you spot it? Well, hello world is a value, it's some text, and our program is doing something with that text. It's outputting it in the terminal with help of that println command, which is built into the FMT package. So println is the operation here, so to say, outputting something to the terminal, and hello world is the value here, which we are using. Now, this value is of a specific type, because you must not forget that Go is a statically typed language, which means we typically have to announce ahead of time with which kind of type we plan on working, and we also do have the concept of types in general. So different values have different types. And there are different kinds of types supported by Go, and here are a couple of key value types which you'll see over the next minutes and throughout this course in general. For example, we have the string type, which you most likely also know from other programming languages. Strings are about plain text, so a string is simply some text which you're working with. An example would be hello there, or why, or as we have it in our example, hello world. This is a string. Another very common type is an integer, a number in the end. An integer is a number without any decimal places, so a number like -10 or 151. And actually, Go supports different versions of integers, longer and shorter ones, positive ones and possibly negative ones, but int is the most versatile version of that integer and the most common one therefore. It's very generic, it supports big numbers as well as small numbers, and it supports negative as well as positive numbers. Now there are more types, but let's focus on these two for the moment, and let's also see how variables are then created and used in Go.